The dust clung to everything. It coated lips, hair, and uniforms until every Italian and German soldier in the column looked like they had been carved from the same gray clay. Corporal Lorenzo Bianchi shuffled forward with the rest of the defeated, boots dragging along the rutted road outside Tunis on May 12, 1943. The sun pressed down like a weight. Rifles were gone, stacked in surrender. His Carcano had been taken, leaving his hands empty and restless. What stretched before him was staggering. Axis formations, divisions that once fought across deserts, had dissolved into a human river of prisoners. More than 250,000 captured in 1 week. Ahead, American trucks rolled in endless lines, engines growling with mechanical confidence. They seemed more numerous than the men themselves, a motorized city flowing beside the defeated. Bianchi realized grimly that there were more prisoners in this column than rifles in his regiment. A truck rattled past, its bed stacked with K-rations. The soldiers riding it laughed, tossing tins as if they were toys. One fell into the dust. A guard kicked it toward Bianchi, who stooped quickly. The box felt heavy in his hands, marked Meal, Combat, K-ration. Inside was more food than he had seen in days. His unit had been starving on half rations. Here, the Americans treated food as disposable. The humiliation deepened when he remembered his rifle. The Carcano, bolt action, 6 rounds, was slow and awkward. He had first faced the Americans at Hill 609. Their rifles fired with shocking speed, an entire platoon sounding like a machine gun. Later he learned it was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic that spat out 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. America had issued it to every soldier, while his comrades worked bolts like farmers cycling a plow. Even their radios seemed magical. Guards spoke into handsets clipped to their belts, summoning trucks with ease. Italian runners had sprinted across open ground, messages clutched in hand, many cut down before reaching their destination. Here, a private spoke into a box, and the world answered. The air itself carried reminders of defeat. The smell of oil and gasoline hung heavy from convoys that ran parallel to the prisoners. Overhead, an American reconnaissance plane droned lazily, unchallenged. Bianchi thought of his mother waiting in line for bread in Florence, her face lined with worry, ration card trembling in her hand. He imagined telling her he had eaten American food, seen more vehicles in a single afternoon than Italy produced in a year, walked among prisoners more numerous than the people of his hometown. How could words ever explain that this war had already been lost before men like him had fired a shot? The column shuffled forward. Dust rose and mixed with sweat until every swallow tasted of grit. Bianchi chewed the ration bar slowly, ashamed at how good it felt to eat. Around him, the silence was heavy. German officers marched stiff-backed, medals still pinned. Italian privates muttered of shame and relief. He said nothing, but in his mind, a truth repeated itself like a drumbeat. They had never stood a chance. Step after weary step carried him toward captivity. The trucks kept rolling, the engines never faltering, the guards never straining. It was not their courage that broke the Axis. It was this unending river of supply. For America, defeat was impossible, because nothing they lost could not be replaced tomorrow. He lowered his head, staring at the dust beneath his boots. The sound of engines swelled, and the line moved on. His whisper was barely audible, swallowed by dust and despair. We were finished before we began. The sea was angry on July 10, 1943. Throwing white spray across the wooden bow of the Higgins boat as it pitched toward the Sicilian shore. Private Jack Miller gripped his rifle tight across his chest, knuckles white around the M1 Garand. He could taste salt on his lips, mixed with the sourness of nerves. The coxswain shouted over the roar of the surf, his words snatched by the wind, and the boat slammed against another wave. Miller glanced at the men beside him, faces pale beneath helmets, eyes fixed on the ramp that would soon drop into fire. The order came sudden. The ramp splashed down, and sunlight poured in with bullets. The first man leapt forward and was swallowed by water up to his chest. Miller followed, plunging into the Mediterranean, his boots dragging him down, gear biting into his shoulders. He stumbled toward the sand as machine guns rattled from pillboxes on shore. All around, the sea churned with the wakes of landing craft, while explosions from naval shells pounded the beach ahead. Miller raised his rifle and fired from the hip as he moved forward. The Garand barked in sharp, clean rhythm, 8 rounds leaping from the clip as fast as his finger could work the trigger. Around him, the Americans advanced, their fire a rolling thunder. It sounded to him like an entire orchestra of rifles, a harmony of steel and powder. He remembered his training sergeant's words. This rifle wins wars. Now he believed it. Where other armies drilled with bolt actions, pausing between shots to work levers, the Americans flowed forward in continuous fire. An Italian soldier popped up from a shallow trench, fumbling with his Carcano. Miller's Garand cracked before the man could chamber a second round. The difference was brutal and undeniable. Each American private carried firepower equal to 2 or 3 enemy soldiers. This was no accident. The United States had built more than 5 million Garands, arming every infantryman with a semi-automatic weapon that other armies reserved for elite troops. The rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds, sturdy as a fence post, and had become the beating heart of American fire superiority. The sand was hot and soft under Miller's boots, the air thick with cordite and dust. To his right, a machine gun nest erupted in smoke as shells from the cruiser USS Savannah landed with precision, spraying sand like rain. The naval barrage walked inland step by step, called in by radio from shore teams, who somehow kept signals clear even in the storm of battle. Miller could hear the voices on the nets through a radio man crouched nearby, calmly directing fire as though ordering supplies at a depot. Minutes later, the ground shook with another broadside, flattening the enemy's counterattack before it could gather. The Americans dug in by noon, sand and sweat streaking their faces, rifles resting on the rims of shallow foxholes. Miller sucked water from his canteen, the taste metallic, but welcome. All around him, jeeps and DUKWs began to appear on the beach, rolling as if this had been a pier instead of a war zone. Supply seemed endless. Ammunition crates piled high, radios chattered constantly, and men moved with the quiet assurance of a system that had worked out every step in advance. For a moment, Miller thought of home, of cornfields stretching under the Iowa sun. His father had been skeptical when the draft card came, wondering what a farm boy could offer against hardened Axis veterans. Yet here he was, weapon in hand, part of an invasion force that had crossed the sea and carved a foothold on Europe's doorstep. It was not just courage that carried them, but the vast weight of American industry that had built the rifles, the boats, and the ships that covered the beach in fire. As night fell, tracers arced across the sky, red lines bending into the dark. The surf grew calmer, and more craft pushed onto the sand. Miller lay back in his foxhole, Garand across his chest, the steady sound of engines in his ears. He realized then what the Italians and Germans must already suspect. This was only the beginning, and the waves would never stop coming. Hauptmann Ernst Keller stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer III, binoculars pressed against his face as the first American landing craft slammed into the beaches near Gela. Spray and smoke blurred the shoreline, but through the haze he could see figures splashing into the surf, rifles held above their heads, scrambling like ants onto Sicilian soil. He had been assured by superiors that the enemy would falter once the counterattack began. America was supposed to be clumsy, inexperienced, untested in real battle. Yet Keller's instincts warned him the truth would be different. The Americans moved with purpose, their rifles firing so quickly it sounded as though machine guns had been issued to every man. He snapped the binoculars down and gave the order. Engines growled as tanks lurched forward, tracks biting into the dry earth. To his left, infantry of the Hermann Göring Division advanced in lines, supported by Italian soldiers of the 4th Livorno Division. Dust rose around them, stinging eyes and throats, mingling with the acrid tang of oil and cordite. Keller's heart pounded with the thrill of combat. This was the moment he had trained for, the chance to drive the invaders back into the sea. But as his tanks crested a ridge overlooking the beachhead, the world erupted. Shells screamed overhead, then slammed into the ground with thunderous crashes. The cruiser USS Savannah, invisible beyond the horizon, unleashed its broadside. Geysers of earth and sand swallowed entire squads. One Panzer to his right disappeared in a bloom of fire, its turret thrown aside like a toy. Keller shouted for his driver to press forward, but more explosions landed with mechanical precision, walking their way across the battlefield as if guided by an unseen hand. He realized then what was happening. The Americans were calling the strikes by radio, coordinating with ships miles away in real time. Keller's division had radios, but not like this. Their sets were cumbersome, often unreliable, reserved for higher command. Messages to the front usually came by runner, brave young men dashing through fire with orders scribbled on paper. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to summon destruction at will. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie, Keller would later learn, could fit on a man's back and reach 3 miles with clarity. On the beach below, American radio men hunched in shallow foxholes, calmly directing naval guns as though they were moving pieces on a board. Another salvo tore into the ridge, and dirt rained down on Keller's tank. He lowered himself inside the turret, the steel walls echoing with the shock of impact. His crew looked to him for orders, fear written plainly on their faces. He barked commands, forcing them forward, but his confidence wavered. Courage alone could not fight mathematics. The Americans had endless shells, endless ships, endless radios tying it all together. Every time he tried to maneuver, a new barrage found him. The infantry beside his tanks broke under the pressure. Italian soldiers scattered, some throwing down rifles, others clawing at the earth for cover. Even the proud Hermann Göring men hesitated, their lines ragged under the storm of naval fire. Keller swore and tried to rally them, but his voice was drowned out by another explosion that lifted a nearby truck into the air, scattering its cargo like leaves in the wind. Smoke burned his throat. Sweat stung his eyes beneath his helmet. He had believed discipline and tradition would be enough to hold back the Americans, that the enemy would lack the resolve for brutal fighting. Yet what he saw was something else entirely. An army that fought as an extension of a vast machine, every rifle backed by factories, every radio linked to warships, every step reinforced by convoys that seemed to arrive without end. When night finally fell, Keller's battered unit withdrew, leaving burning vehicles behind them. He sat slumped in his hatch, staring at the dark horizon where American ships flashed with fire. His pride felt hollow. Germany had built the finest tanks, the sharpest officers, the most disciplined troops. But here on the beaches of Sicily, he had seen that none of it mattered. The Americans had brought a different kind of war, one measured not in courage, but in abundance, not in tradition, but in technology. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion pressing down. The echoes of naval guns still rolled across the hills. For the first time since donning his uniform, Keller wondered if the Reich could truly win. The thought chilled him more than any shell fire. Lorenzo Bianchi had expected captivity to be silence, a slow march into obscurity. Instead, it was a spectacle of machines that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Days after surrendering in Tunisia, he and hundreds of others were crowded near a coastal holding area, waiting to be moved. The sound reached them first, engines droning over the waves, a chorus that grew until it seemed the sea itself had awakened. He looked up from the dirt and saw them. Ranks of boats advancing toward the shore, their blunt bows rising and falling with the swell. The Americans called them Higgins boats, but to Lorenzo they looked like wooden crates riding the surf. Their ramps crashed down as one, spilling soldiers into the water. Behind them came more, boats carrying jeeps, artillery, crates of supplies. The sea grew crowded with these vessels, moving with a determination that felt almost alive. No storm seemed to stop them. He had heard from guards that when the Allies landed at Gela, the wind had been near gale force, waves more than 3 meters high. Yet still, These flat-bottomed craft clawed their way through the surf and delivered men under fire. Eisenhower himself had called the designer, Andrew Higgins, the man who won the war. Watching the spectacle, Bianchi began to understand why. Just as the boat seemed endless, more strange vehicles appeared, rolling down ramps and straight into the water. Their wheels churned as they swam through the surf, climbing ashore with crates stacked high. They looked absurd, half truck and half boat, but they moved with steady confidence. An American guard explained proudly, DUKWs. Amphibious trucks, Lorenzo repeated the number to himself when he heard it, more than 21,000 of them built. He tried to imagine Italy producing even a fraction of that and failed. The irony gnawed at him. His unit in North Africa had relied on mule trains, trudging through dust to carry a few boxes of ammunition. Fuel was always scarce, food scarcer still. Now he watched as the Americans drove cargo directly off the sea and onto land, a conveyor belt of abundance. They wasted nothing, yet they never seemed to worry about having enough. The sound was as striking as the sight. Higgins' boats slammed their ramps into the surf with the finality of hammers. DUKWs rumbled as their 6 wheels spun, water slapping against their hulls. Trucks groaned under the weight of shells and rations. Over all of it lay the shouts of soldiers directing traffic, each voice confident, unhurried, as though this were not war, but a massive construction project. Lorenzo thought of the Carcano rifle he had surrendered, a weapon designed before he was born. He had carried it through Tunisia, chambering each round carefully, praying he would not be caught fumbling with the bolt under fire. The Americans had given every man an M1 Garand, a semi-automatic that could fire nearly 50 shots a minute. Now he realized the same principle extended beyond rifles. Where the Axis improvised, the Americans standardized. Boats, trucks, radios, each was mass-produced and interchangeable. Their war was built on assembly lines as much as on courage. At dusk, the beach glittered with equipment. Jeeps rolled down from ramps, engines buzzing like insects. Stacks of crates reached taller than men. Lorenzo smelled gasoline thick in the air, heard the metallic clank of chains and ramps, felt the ground tremble as bulldozers pushed new roads through sand. The sea itself seemed conquered, transformed into a highway delivering war at industrial scale. The prisoners sat in silence, watching. Some whispered prayers, others curses. Lorenzo only stared. He knew Italy had built ships, tanks, rifles, but never like this, never in such numbers, never with such reliability. The Americans treated the sea as a partner, not an obstacle. He felt a pang of shame, realizing that his commanders had promised the Allies would never land on Italian soil. Watching Higgins' boats pour ashore, he saw that promise unravel. Night fell, but the engines did not stop. Lamps flickered on, glowing against the waves as more craft pressed forward. The rhythm was relentless, a tide of steel and wood that respected neither darkness nor exhaustion. Lorenzo hugged his knees and tried to sleep, but the sound of engines and surf kept him awake. He whispered to himself in Italian, voice low and fearful, "Even the sea fights for them." The first thing Lorenzo noticed in the American camp was the smell. It was not the reek of oil or the staleness of rations, but the warm sweetness of bread. The scent drifted across the barracks like a promise. He had grown up in Florence, where bread was the measure of every meal. Yet for years now, it had been scarce, rationed by the card, and cut thin enough to see through. That morning, in a camp thousands of miles from home, an American guard carried in a tray stacked high with loaves. He handed each prisoner a thick slice, soft and pale, steam still rising. Lorenzo held it in his hand, almost afraid it would vanish if he blinked. He bit in, and the crust gave way with a softness he hadn't tasted in years. For a moment, shame and hunger warred within him. Here he was, a prisoner, yet eating better than his family back home. The irony was cruel, but the bread silenced his pride. Around him, other Italians tore into their slices with the desperation of men who no longer cared how they looked. The Americans called this place a prisoner of war camp, but to Lorenzo it felt like another world. There were clean bunks lined in rows, hot showers with water that ran without interruption, and guards who enforced discipline but not cruelty. He had expected barbed wire and brutality. Instead, he found routine. They were woken with bugles, marched to meals, and assigned work details. It was strict, but never cruel. The guards treated them more like wayward employees than enemies. Soon he learned that prisoners would be given the option to work in Italian service units. These men wore special armbands and labored in depots, ports, and farms across the United States. They were not forced. They volunteered, and almost all of them did. The numbers were staggering. Over 45,000 Italian POWs agreed to join these units, out of 50-odd thousand captured on American soil. Lorenzo could see why. In the service units, they received better food, more freedom, and even pay. The Americans trusted their prisoners enough to let them handle supplies, a gesture unthinkable under the regime he had served. The contrasts gnawed at him. He thought of the rations in Tunisia: stale bread, watery soup, bitter coffee substitute, and compared it to what he now saw discarded in camp trash bins. Apples with only one bite taken, half-finished tins of meat, cigarettes ground into the dirt with no second thought. Waste, the officers had called it. To Lorenzo, it was wealth beyond imagination. America produced so much that its soldiers could throw away what his comrades had once fought over. At night, lying in his bunk, Lorenzo listened to the distant rumble of trains. He asked a guard once what they carried. The man shrugged and said, "Tanks, planes, you name it. We're shipping out thousands every week." The numbers blurred in Lorenzo's mind. He knew Italy had built a few hundred tanks during the entire war. Now, even from captivity, he could hear proof that America moved thousands as easily as sacks of flour. He thought often of his mother, queuing for bread with a ration card in her trembling hands. He imagined writing to her about this place, about the white bread that came every morning without fail, about the food that was measured not in scarcity, but in surplus. Would she believe him? Could anyone in Italy believe that their captured sons lived with more abundance than the civilians who remained at home? The camp was not paradise. There were fences and guards, and freedom was a memory. Yet even here, in defeat, Lorenzo felt the weight of American power more clearly than he ever had in battle. The rifles and tanks were terrifying, yes, but it was the bread that undid him, the daily proof that America could feed its enemies better than Italy could feed its own people. On one of his first mornings, as the bread was passed down the line, he caught himself whispering a prayer of thanks. Then he froze, ashamed. He was praying not for Italy, not for victory, but for another slice tomorrow. It was then that he understood what none of his officers had ever admitted. The war was already lost, not because Italian soldiers lacked courage, but because America had turned its factories and fields into weapons, and those weapons were more powerful than any rifle or tank. He finished the bread slowly, savoring every bite. Around him, the camp stirred to life with the sound of boots and bugles, another day beginning under foreign flags. Lorenzo looked at the slice in his hand, then at the fences beyond. The guards walked their patrols, rifles slung casually, confident and unhurried. The prisoners filed toward the mess hall, shadows in the morning sun. For the first time, Lorenzo no longer asked when he would go home. Instead, he wondered what other impossibilities America could make real. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson stood on the damp dockside in southern England, clipboard in hand, watching cranes swing crates of ammunition into the yawning hold of a Liberty ship. The fog hung low over the channel, muffling the sound of gulls, but not the thunder of industry that filled every port from Liverpool to Plymouth. The ship before her was not elegant. Its lines were blunt, its hull unpainted gray, the weld seams still visible where plates had been fused together in record time. Yet this ungainly vessel could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo, and more of its kind slid into the water every week than she could keep count of. She checked the manifest, ticking off artillery shells, rations, spare engines, tires, and crates of Garand rifles. The numbers blurred, but she forced herself to keep pace. Each ship was just one in a tide. 2,710 Liberty ships were being built, alongside more than 500 Victory ships, faster and larger successors. In some American yards, new hulls were launched in under a month. A few had been built in less than 2 weeks. Sarah often thought of what a single vessel meant for the war, a shipload of tanks, or food for an entire division. Then she thought of them by the hundred, and even she, surrounded by paperwork, felt awe. Behind her, the rattle of engines announced a convoy of trucks arriving from the depot. Jeeps rolled down ramps, lined up like obedient soldiers, ready to be lashed to the decks. Each one was identical, each stamped with serial numbers from plants that produced them by the hundreds of thousands. More than 648,000 Jeeps had been built, and there seemed no end to them. She could remember back in 1941 when the Army had been scrambling to buy civilian vehicles just to move troops. Now, in 1944, she had warehouses so full of spares that damaged Jeeps were often abandoned and replaced rather than repaired. On the horizon, the skeletal frame of another Liberty ship was already taking shape. Welders worked through the night, sparks falling into the water like fireflies. Sarah marveled that one shipyard could outproduce entire Axis fleets. In Italy, merchant vessels were dwindling. In Germany, U-boats slipped from their pens in small numbers, but never fast enough to catch the flood pouring across the Atlantic. The impossible statistic was this. In 1943, American yards launched more shipping tonnage in a single month than Italy produced in a year. The human scale of the effort was just as immense. Thousands of women worked the docks, uniforms smudged with grease, hair tied back in scarves. Teenagers sorted shells, farmers' sons drove forklifts, engineers measured hull plates. Sarah had grown used to the rhythm, trains clattering in from the Midlands with steel, trucks roaring from factories with crates, cranes lifting and lowering without pause. War, for her, was not about holding ground with bayonets. It was about making sure the right cargo reached the right ship at the right hour. At night, when the convoys rolled out toward assembly areas, she sometimes walked the length of the docks to clear her head. The scale never failed to stagger her. In one yard, she might see a line of Shermans, more than 40 in a row, engines idling, each destined for France. In another, rows of aircraft wings stacked like lumber, ready to be bolted to fuselages. She had once read the statistics in a briefing. Nearly 300,000 aircraft built during the war, 96,000 in 1944 alone. Even reading the figures, she could hardly believe them. But seeing row after row of crates labeled P-51 or B-17 made it real. She thought of the enemy across the channel. German soldiers might fight with skill and courage, but they could not fight arithmetic. They could not stop ships that arrived faster than U-boats could sink them, or rifles built faster than they could fire their own. Sarah believed every box she ticked off her clipboard was a bullet already on its way to ending the war. As the Liberty ship's horn bellowed, signaling departure, Sarah signed the final page of her manifest and handed it to the deck officer. She watched the ship ease from the dock, its bow turning toward the Atlantic. Another would take its place tomorrow, and another the day after that. She tucked her clipboard under her arm, her breath clouding in the cold air. This war would be decided not just on beaches or in foxholes, but here, in the endless rhythm of factories without end. The sun had not yet risen when Sergeant Michael Reyes climbed into the driver's seat of his 2.5-ton truck at the Red Ball Express depot near Paris. The air smelled of diesel and wet asphalt, the mist hanging low over the convoy staging area like a blanket. Around him, hundreds of trucks waited, engines idling, headlights glowing through the fog. Drivers yawned, rubbed frostbitten hands, and checked manifests one last time. In a few hours, the roads would be a river of iron stretching across France, carrying the lifeblood of an advancing army. Michael had learned quickly that the Red Ball Express was more than a supply route. It was a race against entropy, against shortages, and sometimes against the enemy. Every truck carried food, ammunition, fuel, or spare parts. Sometimes all four in the same load. Each truck had a destination, usually a forward supply depot, where quartermasters and clerks would unload cargo and redirect it to divisions on the front lines. On this route, mistakes meant delays that could stall an entire offensive. As the convoy rolled out, Michael kept a steady speed, 35 miles per hour over cracked French roads, dodging potholes and occasional shell craters. Behind him, a string of trucks stretched for miles, painted in olive drab, tires coated with mud. Drivers relied on hand signals, horns, and radio chatter to navigate. Overhead, American reconnaissance planes traced their route, scanning for lurking German armor or saboteurs. Each mile carried an invisible weight. Every crate, barrel, and case could mean life or death for soldiers awaiting the next push. The scale was staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated more than 6,000 trucks, running day and night. Convoys moved in organized chaos, alternating routes, timed departures, and constant vehicle maintenance. Each truck averaged nearly 300 miles per shift, delivering more than 12 million tons of supplies over 2 months. One impossible statistic burned in Michael's mind. In a single day, the Red Ball Express could deliver more fuel than the Germans consumed in a month along the same front. The numbers were unbelievable. Yet the lines of trucks on the horizon made them undeniable. Despite the rhythm, danger lurked. German snipers sometimes emerged from the woods, and a mine could instantly silence a truck. Drivers like Michael wore steel helmets, carried rifles, and drove with nerves taut as piano wires. Night convoys were worst, when headlights attracted attention from hidden artillery or patrols. But luck, skill, and sheer volume kept the system flowing. If one truck was lost, dozens more would arrive to replace it, an unbroken chain that demonstrated industrial supremacy in motion. Michael glanced at the cargo manifest taped to the dashboard. Fuel drums for Sherman tanks, boxes of M1 Garands, spare engines, and rations for infantry units, everything accounted for. Each ton was a promise that American industry could keep, a promise the enemy could not match. The Germans might have prepared fortified lines, but for every obstacle they erected, Michael's convoy carried the solution. For every destroyed bridge, pontoon engineers rebuilt it overnight. The numbers translated into action. 400,000 gallons of gasoline delivered in a single day, enough to move an entire armored division forward without pause. Hours blurred as the convoy pushed through forests and bombed out villages. Michael thought of the factories back in the United States, producing trucks, fuel, and rifles by the thousands, the invisible hand shaping the outcome of this war. He remembered Sarah Thompson on the docks, the Liberty ships, the rhythm of production that never stopped. That rhythm was alive here too, in the grind of gears, the roar of engines, the coordination of human effort across miles of road. By evening, the convoy reached its destination. Soldiers rushed forward to unload supplies with practiced efficiency. Michael leaned back in his seat for a moment, listening to the hum of engines cooling and the shuffle of men moving crates. The war was not won in a single battle, but in the continuous motion of trucks and ships, the relentless application of industrial power to a battlefield that spanned an entire continent. As night fell, Michael climbed back into his truck, ready for another round. He watched the headlights of departing trucks wind like a luminous river through the dark countryside, a testament to American ingenuity and determination. The Red Ball Express never truly stopped. It moved like the pulse of a nation at war, carrying forward the promise that abundance, coordination, and human resolve could overwhelm any enemy. The first light of dawn glinted off the polished steel of a Sherman tank as it rumbled into position on a shattered French hillside. Private First Class Henry Donovan wiped the grime from his faceplate, the smell of burnt fuel and gunpowder clinging to his uniform. Around him, the mechanical heartbeat of American armored divisions stirred, tanks revving, half-tracks maneuvering, artillery pieces being readied. Every vehicle, every man, was part of a larger organism, a metallic tide that pressed forward relentlessly. Henry's crew was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, one of many spearheads in the push across Europe. They knew the stories. German defenses dug deep into forests, towns turned to fortresses, and panzer divisions waiting to strike. Yet the numbers reassured them. There were simply more tanks, more trucks, more fuel than the enemy could muster. One division alone operated over 300 Sherman tanks, supported by nearly 200 self-propelled guns and more than 1,500 trucks ferrying fuel and ammunition. The scale was staggering, almost impossible to comprehend for men standing among the rolling steel. The Germans opened fire from a concealed ridge. Shells ricocheted off the armored hulls with a metallic clang. Henry's tank returned fire, the 75mm cannon spitting molten steel into enemy positions. The smell of scorched earth and ozone filled the air. Coordination was crucial. American doctrine emphasized speed, maneuver, and combined arms. Infantry advanced alongside tanks, engineers cleared obstacles, and artillery delivered suppressive fire with almost choreographed precision. Every step was calculated, every shot accounted for. One impossible statistic haunted the regiment's daily briefings. A single American tank factory could produce more Sherman tanks in a month than the entire German panzer production lines could manage in a year. Every Sherman that rolled off the assembly line meant another division could press forward, another enemy position could be neutralized, another road kept open for convoys like Michael's Red Ball Express. Victory was no longer a matter of tactics alone. It was the product of industrial capacity translated into combat effectiveness. Henry adjusted the radio, listening to other units reporting forward. Enemy resistance had been strongest near the village of St. Lo, where fortified buildings had been converted into makeshift bunkers. The 3rd Armored Division pressed through, tank tracks gouging mud and rubble. Behind every unit were supply trucks loaded with shells, spare parts, and rations, an endless chain of support that ensured forward momentum. Each tank destroyed a German emplacement, and each destroyed emplacement was replaced with another American vehicle arriving almost instantly to hold the line. The crew witnessed engineers bridging a cratered road. The planks laid so quickly it seemed like magic. The tanks pressed onward, the shell fire echoing off nearby hills. Henry thought of the factories back in Detroit, the foundries in Pittsburgh, the shipyards in Baltimore, all churning out steel and engines in a coordinated rhythm. That rhythm manifested here in the battlefield's chaos, turning what could have been a grinding slog into a calculated advance. Hours later, the division secured the village, German forces retreating in disarray. Casualty reports confirmed a ratio that seemed impossible. For every American lost, 10 enemy soldiers had been killed or captured. It was a grim statistic, yet it underscored the effect of overwhelming industrial and tactical superiority. Tanks, fuel, and ammunition had combined to create a force the enemy could not match, no matter how determined. As Henry's crew refueled and rearmed, he looked across the battlefield at the smoldering ruins and advancing columns of steel. The war's outcome was being written in these small victories, repeated across hundreds of miles. American ingenuity, coordination, and sheer productive power had transformed ordinary men into a force capable of reshaping the continent. Steel and fire, precision and production, abundance and courage, all converged to create unstoppable momentum. By evening, the tanks settled into defensive positions, engines cooling, crews tending minor repairs, and infantry establishing perimeter lines. The smell of smoke and oil lingered, but so did the satisfaction of forward movement. The 3rd Armored Division was poised to push deeper into Germany, the battlefield a testament to the American synthesis of human initiative and industrial capacity. Henry closed his logbook and watched the horizon glow red, a reminder that the war was far from over, yet the tide had already turned. The morning fog clung to the Ruhr Valley, curling around the smokestacks of factories that had once belched only coal and steel, now producing the engines of liberation. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell crouched behind the berm of a shattered road, binoculars pressed to her eyes, tracing the columns of American armor and supply vehicles snaking toward the industrial heart of Germany. From this vantage, the scale of the operation was almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and dozens of artillery batteries, each moving in precise synchrony. The battlefield had become a testament to what industry could achieve when fused with tactical ingenuity. Mitchell's unit was part of the 9th Infantry Division, supporting armored thrusts into the Ruhr industrial sector. Intelligence had reported stubborn German defenses, reinforced bunkers, minefields, and panzer remnants dug in along the river's edge. Yet the Americans pressed forward, their advance orchestrated like a vast, lethal clockwork. Artillery fire from M7 Priest self-propelled guns pounded enemy fortifications with 105mm shells, each round delivered with mechanical precision and backed by meticulous calculations of trajectory, powder weight, and target composition. The cacophony of explosions mingled with the drone of engines, creating a symphony of controlled chaos that seemed impossible to resist. One particularly staggering fact circulated among division officers. In a single week, American factories produced more 105mm shells than the Wehrmacht had in their entire stockpile for that sector. To soldiers like Mitchell, this statistic translated into an unshakable confidence. Every German pillbox that erupted in flame, every machine gun nest reduced to rubble, was simply another instance of American abundance meeting disciplined application. The men understood viscerally that each shell, each tank, each bolt of steel represented the efforts of thousands back home, men and women whose labor on assembly lines directly determined the fate of the front. The Germans launched counterattacks, sending Panzer Grenadiers and a handful of Tigers into the valley. The Tigers' armor was formidable, their 88mm cannons capable of annihilating a Sherman at hundreds of meters. Yet numbers and coordination proved decisive. Sherman tanks maneuvered in overlapping arcs, supported by bazooka teams and airstrikes from P-47 Thunderbolts. For every Tiger, 3 or 4 Shermans engaged simultaneously, a lethal ballet choreographed by American doctrine, emphasizing combined arms and initiative at the unit level. Mitchell watched as a Tiger was immobilized by concentrated fire, its crew surrendering under the relentless pressure of sheer weight of numbers. By midday, the valley floor was a testament to American industrial might. Hundreds of destroyed enemy vehicles lay scattered, yet for every one destroyed, reinforcements and supplies arrived seamlessly from the rear. Trucks unloaded fuel and ammunition at the front lines, engineers repaired bridges, and medics evacuated the wounded with systematic efficiency. Casualty ratios once again appeared almost unbelievable. For every American soldier downed, the division had inflicted losses that approached 15-1. This disparity was not mere luck. It was the result of production, planning, and human endurance acting in unison. Mitchell moved with her squad through the smoking ruins of an abandoned village, securing positions and checking communications with forward artillery. The Germans, though valiant, were trapped in a spiral, every defensive measure met by overwhelming counterforce, every counterattack swallowed by coordinated American firepower. The war's outcome, once uncertain in the dense forests of Ardennes, now seemed inevitable in industrial landscapes like the Ruhr. Even in the midst of carnage, Mitchell's thoughts drifted to the home front. Detroit's engine plants, Pittsburgh's steel mills, and countless small factories had turned raw materials into vehicles, shells, and rifles at a pace the enemy could not replicate. This tidal wave of production underpinned every tactical success. The individual heroism on the battlefield was magnified 100-fold by the invisible labor of civilians thousands of miles away. American democracy, with its culture of initiative and ingenuity, had transformed material abundance into an insurmountable strategic advantage. As night fell, Mitchell's unit secured the final ridge overlooking the Ruhr River. Fires from destroyed German machinery painted the valley in orange and black, a visual ledger of production meeting tactical excellence. The division's forward momentum had turned the industrial heartland into a hollowed, liberated space. Soldiers dug in for the night, engines idling, radios crackling updates from adjacent units. The tipping point had been reached. German forces could no longer replace losses fast enough to stem the American advance, and every mile gained was a step closer to collapse. Lieutenant Mitchell, kneeling beside a Sherman and watching the distant horizon, understood the significance. Not individual valor alone, not tactical brilliance alone, but the marriage of production, coordination, and courage had rewritten the rules of war. The battle in the Ruhr was not just fought with guns and steel, it was won in factories, in offices, and in every American home contributing to the war effort. Tomorrow, the advance would continue. The enemy could only retreat or perish under the relentless tide of American ingenuity. Dawn broke over the shattered plains of the Ruhr, a pale light glinting off the twisted hulls of German tanks and scorched factories. Major Thomas Reynolds stepped from his command post, the acrid smell of burnt steel and smoldering buildings filling his nostrils. The devastation was total, yet orderly, a paradox only possible because every American advance had been underwritten by the unmatched production capabilities of the homeland. From this vantage, Reynolds could see the scale of victory, entire divisions moving with precision, artillery emplacements silent now, having delivered their final verdict, and engineers preparing to restore bridges and rail lines even as the enemy had crumbled. The statistics told a story that words alone could scarcely capture. Over the previous 2 weeks, the U.S. had produced 9,700 tanks and armored vehicles, more than the Germans had in all of 1943. Artillery shells poured forward at a rate of 150,000 per day, exceeding the enemy's total monthly stockpile. Every factory, from Detroit to Buffalo, was a node in a vast network of lethal coordination. Soldiers in the field witnessed these numbers only indirectly, through the unending tide of reinforcements, the seemingly magical replenishment of ammunition, and the inexhaustible supply of fuel that allowed armor to surge without pause. Reynolds reviewed reports from subordinate commanders. Casualty ratios were extraordinary. In several engagements, American losses had been measured in dozens, while German fatalities numbered in the hundreds. These figures, almost impossible to believe, underscored the truth that industrial might had become as decisive as any tactical maneuver. Yet the human dimension remained, tangible in the exhaustion etched on the faces of soldiers, medics, and engineers alike. The war was being waged in sweat and sacrifice as much as in steel and ordnance. From the enemy's perspective, the situation was grim. German commanders recorded every setback, every loss of materiel and territory, knowing they could not match American output. Panther tanks immobilized for lack of spare parts, ammunition shortages crippling defensive positions, entire divisions rendered inert by supply failures. These were the consequences of scarcity, meeting the prodigious capacity of a democracy at war. The German High Command, once confident, now faced the realization that their technological skill and tactical training could not compensate for their inability to replace losses at scale. On the ground, the effects were immediate. American infantry advanced into villages that had once been defended by seasoned Wehrmacht units, finding only skeleton crews, abandoned positions, and booby-trapped bunkers. Sherman tanks, repaired overnight by forward maintenance teams, rolled unimpeded through streets where German artillery had previously dominated. Forward observers directed artillery fire with exacting precision, turning every engagement into a controlled exercise in destruction. The integration of technology, logistics, and human initiative was a living demonstration of what historians would later call industrial democracy in action. The air above was no less decisive. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts patrolled relentlessly, striking supply convoys and rail junctions with surgical accuracy. Each sortie underscored the imbalance between American and German capacity. A single day's aerial campaign could destroy more fuel and munitions than the enemy produced in a month, creating a feedback loop of scarcity that left German units isolated and impotent. Soldiers on the ground, while enduring fatigue and fear, recognized this truth instinctively. They were fighting not just a disciplined enemy, but the consequences of industrial disparity. Reynolds took a moment to walk through a captured supply depot. Stacks of food, ammunition, and medical supplies filled the buildings, a stark contrast to the near-empty depots the Germans could muster. It was a vivid lesson in the power of abundance. Here, the individual soldier's courage was amplified by the collective capacity of a nation. Each crate of supplies, a tangible expression of democratic values translated into martial effectiveness. By midday, the operational picture was clear. The Ruhr had fallen. German forces were retreating in disarray, and American units were consolidating gains for the next phase of the advance. The significance of the battle extended beyond territory or casualties. It demonstrated decisively that in the industrialized war of the 20th century, production could be as lethal as any weapon system. The human drama of valor, sacrifice, and ingenuity had been inseparable from the material reality of American industrial superiority. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the valley, Reynolds stood on a ridge and surveyed the scene. Fires from destroyed equipment flickered across the landscape, illuminating the toll exacted on the enemy and the cost of victory. The Americans had not only won a battle, they had demonstrated the strategic principle that abundance, coordinated and disciplined, could overwhelm even the most formidable of foes. Tomorrow, the focus would shift to reconstruction, reorganization, and preparing for the final phases of the war. But tonight, the battlefield itself whispered the enduring lesson. That industrial democracy, married to courage and strategy, had irrevocably tipped the scales of history. The smell of scorched earth had faded, leaving only the metallic tang of spent ordnance and the faint, ever-present aroma of machinery oil. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Hayes stepped onto the docks of Antwerp, where American supply ships unloaded thousands of tons of rations, fuel, and spare parts. Civilians, once cowed by occupation, now moved freely, observing the mechanical ballet of cranes, trucks, and soldiers. For Hayes, the human dimension of war was inseparable from the statistical one. Every pallet delivered, every crate moved, represented an unbroken chain linking domestic factories to frontline resilience. American planners began to assess what victory had truly cost and what it had achieved. The sheer scale of production was almost incomprehensible. By mid-1945, the United States had produced 88,410 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and 41 million tons of ordnance. Daily output from single plants sometimes exceeded the yearly capacity of entire enemy nations. These numbers, impressive on paper, became legendary in retrospect. Soldiers in the field had witnessed this indirectly. Ammunition was always available, reinforcements arrived on schedule, and even in the most desperate situations, the promise of logistical support never failed. From a human perspective, the lessons were equally vivid. Corporal James Whitman recalled standing in a bombed-out village, watching a Sherman tank repaired, and returned to combat within hours. Nearby, medics triaged wounded soldiers with a precision born from rigorous training and a steady stream of supplies. The war had transformed civilians into combatants, assembly line workers into essential components of military strategy, and ordinary citizens into contributors to a global struggle. Each individual's labor, whether in Detroit's foundries or the steel mills of Pittsburgh, directly influenced outcomes on distant battlefields. Enemy commanders, now prisoners of circumstance, reflected bitterly on the disparity. German divisions had fought valiantly, demonstrating tactical skill and courage, yet could not replace lost equipment, fuel, or munitions. The contrast was stark. Where Americans benefited from abundance, the enemy suffered from scarcity, and the imbalance had proved fatal. Tactical genius could not compensate for industrial insufficiency, and this strategic truth would shape military thinking for decades. Analysis of operational data revealed staggering ratios. In the Battle of the Bulge alone, American forces expended 2.3 million rounds of artillery, while suffering fewer than 20,000 casualties, whereas German forces lost 90,000 men and nearly 2,000 tanks. These impossible statistics, while difficult to digest, crystallize the interplay of human courage, technological sophistication, and industrial supremacy. They were lessons in the integration of democracy, technology, and logistics as instruments of warfare. Hayes walked among soldiers who were returning equipment, repairing vehicles, and preparing for redeployment. She noted the continuity of purpose. The American military system was designed not merely to win battles, but to sustain momentum, to convert victory into strategic leverage. Every action, from a factory worker tightening a bolt to a pilot navigating a strafing run, was part of an interlocking mechanism. The war had been won not only by valor but by a society that understood production itself could be a weapon. As night fell over the port, Hayes reflected on the transformation. Democracy, abundance, and initiative had triumphed over authoritarian rigor and scarcity. The war had demonstrated that the marriage of industrial power with strategic vision could achieve results previously unimaginable. Tomorrow, statisticians, historians, and veterans would begin to record, analyze, and commemorate the lessons of this unparalleled effort, ensuring that the principles underpinning victory would endure. The sun rose over the horizon of the next day with quiet solemnity. Hayes knew the war was ending, but its echoes, industrial, human, and moral, would resonate through history. Victory had been achieved not by chance but by a deliberate, disciplined, and extraordinary harnessing of national capacity. And in that realization lay a promise. A nation that could organize, equip, and inspire its people could overcome even the most formidable adversary. In the silent halls of Washington, policymakers pored over graphs, spreadsheets, and field reports, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable, the enduring supremacy of a democratic industrial war machine. General Robert Lawson traced his finger along a map of Europe, noting how American forces had penetrated enemy lines, liberated occupied territories, and systematically dismantled the military infrastructure of totalitarian regimes. Every advance had been prefigured by industrial output, every victory preceded by months of calculation and production. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Across 4 years, the United States had shipped more than 90 million tons of supplies overseas, produced over 2.5 million vehicles, and constructed 124,000 aircraft, enough to equip every Allied nation multiple times over. One factory in Ohio could turn out more tanks in a single month than the Germans could manufacture in a year. In the field, these figures manifested as overwhelming firepower, endless reinforcements, and logistical resilience that left enemies perpetually on the defensive. Soldiers like Private Samuel Ortiz, witnessing armored divisions sweeping past shattered villages, understood instinctively that American abundance had become a strategic weapon. The lessons extended beyond war. Strategic thinkers recognized that technological innovation, combined with democratic oversight, could generate power unparalleled in human history. Every successful amphibious landing, every armored breakthrough, and every sustained campaign demonstrated the principle. The capacity to produce, repair, and sustain forces at scale was as decisive as battlefield heroism. Civilian factories, once concerned only with consumer goods, had become engines of national security. Assembly lines hummed the tune of victory. Enemy strategists had confronted this reality in disbelief. German commanders recorded their losses with a mixture of admiration and frustration. They had fought skillfully, maneuvered expertly, yet could not overcome an adversary whose production capabilities dwarfed their own. Casualty ratios, tank losses, and destroyed infrastructure all bore witness to a simple truth: material sufficiency, coordinated with training and morale, determined outcomes more than doctrine or courage alone. On a human scale, the war had elevated the ordinary citizen to historic significance. Factory workers, engineers, and logisticians were as critical to victory as infantrymen and pilots. Families had contributed to rationing, war bonds, and labor mobilization, weaving personal sacrifice into a national tapestry of strength. Veterans recalled that each shipment of supplies felt like a shield and a sword, every repaired tank a testament to invisible hands shaping the course of history. Lawson reviewed casualty statistics and operational efficiency charts. The data was staggering. In several engagements, the U.S. had inflicted losses exceeding 100-to-1 ratios against German armored divisions, while maintaining an operational readiness above 95%. Entire campaigns could be described as demonstrations of industrial democracy, where the disciplined application of technology and human initiative amplified battlefield effectiveness exponentially. These outcomes were the product of a society harnessing abundance, innovation, and civic commitment for a singular purpose. As evening fell over the capital, Lawson imagined future generations studying this moment. The war had proven that strategic advantage was inseparable from industrial capacity, that democracy could be weaponized not through coercion, but through coordinated productivity, and that human courage was magnified when paired with inexhaustible resources. The legacy of American supremacy was not merely territorial or military, it was a model for how societies could marshal knowledge, skill, and abundance to achieve objectives once thought unattainable. From the highest command to the humblest soldier, from factory floor to battlefield, the same principle resonated. Abundance, guided by discipline and democratic values, could overwhelm any foe. As the lights of Washington glimmered against the night sky, the country understood that the lessons of this conflict would endure. The war had ended, but the story of industrial democracy, strategic foresight, and human courage would echo through generations, shaping both memory and policy. Victory was never accidental, it was engineered, and its blueprint would remain a cornerstone of American military identity for the century to come.